Your Heart Out. A love letter to LGBTQ people in recovery. For the queers who have made enemies of their bodies, blessed are the spaces we take up, the kisses planted on our stomachs. The kiss there is the kiss gold. I promise we shall bear as witnesses to greatness. We will move and move boldly. Hugeness should not be feared, for our histories speak cosmic. What capacities do we build for joy? What beyond our physical can allow us? What love do you know is inside of you?
There are a lot of common misconceptions that arise whenever you talk about eating disorders in the LGBT plus community, and I would say the most common one has to be that people who are LGBTQ plus don't experience eating disorders, which is a really weird misconception for me, but I think it comes out of just a massive lack of representation. Whenever we see eating disorders, they're often represented by straight, white, cisgender people, which means you never really get an in-depth discussion of what it means to have an eating disorder outside of that. And that also means that you never get to dive into the reasoning that somebody who is queer, for example, might have an eating disorder. A lot of the time people kind of assume people have an eating disorder because they're trying to make themselves more attractive. So as a woman, somebody might think I was trying to be more attractive for a man, but in reality, it might come from a whole lot of other reasons. Coming out, for example, is very traumatic. That might cause an eating disorder because you feel out of control. That kind of thing, we just never really hear about what you can experience outside of being straight and cis. In my experience, people find it really difficult to talk about eating disorders, and I think that's understandable. You know, I think as a society, we're beginning to talk more about mental health. We're beginning to break down the stigma that surrounds things like depression and anxiety. We're beginning to regard mental health as equally as important as physical health. And the difficulty, particularly when it comes to eating disorders, is that I find when I talk about it, is that you aren't only unpacking a mental health issue. When I'm talking about an eating disorder, I have to unpack a lot of different things. It's not just about how I feel and how this eating disorder affects me. It's about diet culture and how that affects it. It's about fat phobia and how that affects it. It's about my individual experiences as a person and how that has played into my eating disorder. And it's about the normalization of, you know, disordered eating habits that we experience as a society. It's about a lack of support and a lack of understanding, both from professionals and from general everyday people. It's not easy to talk about because it makes people uncomfortable. I started making videos about my experience with my eating disorder, with being denied treatment, and with my own recovery that I'm taking on my own, because I didn't see myself represented in the media. I didn't see other people who looked like me. I didn't see people who were queer. I didn't see anybody who I related to. You're not alone if you have an eating disorder, but you don't look the way that media traditionally paints you. You can have an eating disorder and be plus size. You can have an eating disorder and be a man. You can have an eating disorder and be Muslim. It's not impossible. Eating disorders are difficult to talk about. They are uncomfortable, and they do make us look at ourselves in ways that maybe we've never looked at ourselves before. But the more we talk about them, the more we can begin to break down the stigma that surrounds disordered eating. The more we can support people who deal with eating disorders, the more we can support each other when we're just struggling with food. The more we talk about them, the more safety we provide for the people who are suffering in silence a lot of the time. And the more we talk about them as communities that don't always talk about things like this, as the Black communities, as the queer communities, the more we talk about these things, the more we open up a space to help people heal. And I think that's the most important thing we can do.
There could and should be more examples of eating disorders and recovery stories geared towards LGBT people, not only in traditional media, but in medical literature too. The closest I've come to finding stories like mine are in fringe places on the internet, which is incredibly othering. And I don't think I'm particularly different or special. And so using simple logic, I can assume I cannot be the only person going through this, and therefore there must be other people similarly experiencing the same things that I am. But you just don't see that at all in mainstream media.
I have had a surprisingly hard time beginning the recording of this actual vlog. I very often use my lived experience within my artwork. And I think the fact that I'll be sending out something that's quite so raw to someone else has created a sense of anxiety within me. It's completely not lost on me that I like to have a lot of control. I have a neurological condition called myasthenia gravis. So it affects my voluntary musculoskeletal muscles. So things like my facial muscles, my arms, any muscle which is basically attached to my skeleton and has voluntary movement to it. I get facial paralysis almost, so I can't control the muscles in my face, in my eyes, in my throat, and in my chest. So the muscles that control a lot of the breathing motion. What this does is it makes me highly susceptible to choking. And I've had an unfortunate event where I've had pneumonia due to the fact that I had a piece of donut stuck in my left lung. It can make the process of eating very difficult and painful and scary because you don't know whether or not you can eat. That's where a lot of my fear stems from, not knowing whether or not I can eat. I always tend to find mainstream pride to be centered around consumption a lot. Consumption of brands, of alcohol, of substances, and of food, obviously. And it is it's a very physical type of event. You're always on your feet. And I get incredibly fatigued very easily. And generally when I'm fatigued, I tend to start getting symptoms again and weaknesses. With myself seeing myself as someone who is essentially disabled, I wish that it was more accessible.
I think there is unfortunately a link between LGBTQ folks' identities and their eating disorders, if they have them. Androgyny is still perceived as conforming to the Western beauty standards, which are thin, white, toned, abled, clear skin. Before I was read more consistently as male, I'd convinced myself, because my body was curvy and had a more typically feminine fat distribution, that this was a huge contributing factor into how strangers perceived my gender. Regarding sexuality also, and the toxic mindsets that can crop up in the gay community, I felt an unspoken pressure to be more definitively a discernible body type that the men that I was attracted to liked. Trans folks seem to be reporting higher experiences of eating disorders, and I believe that the lack of access to trans healthcare which addresses dysphoria and explored options is probably a contributor to this. I actually feel like I've had two eating disorders. One of them as a young teenager and the other one as a young adult, both of them quite intricately connected to gender. So the first one really started around puberty. That was the onset of my mental health problems. I didn't have the language or the self-awareness to articulate why my body changing was so difficult for me, which I think led to feeling even more isolated and misunderstood than your average teenager. I actually went to an all-girls primary and secondary school and was very much bullied for being different in both. Being autistic too, I think that led to a lot of miscommunication. I missed a lot of social cues and I didn't understand a lot of the fashions and interests and that my peers had, or why it was such a big deal if I wasn't involved in them. I saw children and adolescent mental health services weekly for depression and found that they really didn't focus on my attitude toward food or my body. It was very much damage control with my other mental health problems. I didn't feel seen or listened to or understood in any way, which I think added to my need to control and keep secret this unhealthy relationship with food. It wasn't an overnight change, but these mental health issues were absolutely centralized around the onset of puberty. It's really easy to say with hindsight, oh, you're trans. But at the time, I had no idea that people assigned female at birth could even be trans. Growing up, there was no representation or information in the media. There was no visibility. I spent the next 4 or so years in a really unhappy place, using unhealthy coping mechanisms, treating my body with no care whatsoever. I contacted the gender clinic in my second year of study against my family's wishes, and was told there was around a 12-month wait for a first appointment. Gender-affirming medical care is often a huge relief for trans folk. It can be a really positive thing, but the waiting times in the UK for treatment on the NHS are ridiculous. It's an odd one that we still perceive androgyny as thin. I believe it's rooted in a deeply ableist and white power structure. There is no one way to be a trans man or even a man. Men can have bodies that aren't chiseled and toned. Men can wear whatever they like, be that nail polish, skirts, and men can have eating disorders. Such rigid and oppressive expectations of what constitutes gender not only harms trans folk, it harms queer and gender non-conforming people, and even cis people who present as neutral or androgynous. The system, is being challenged, but I think the biggest changes have yet to come.